So, why poetry? I'll say more about this on Wednesday, but I'm going to invite you if you're a person who has thought, I don't get poetry or I don't like poetry. Poetry makes me feel stupid. That is a common feeling. So, you're in good company. And I'm just going to ask you to set that feeling to one side. Don't abandon it. Just hold it as a hypothesis while I try to talk about why I believe poetry is really a powerful healing tool. And for those of you who do ministry, an essential, strong tool in your toolkit that is not yet as widely accepted as music therapy or art therapy, for example, where we've really come to understand that those are important parts of helping people. But poetry, not as much yet, although there is a whole National Society of Poetry Therapists in the United States, and healing arts departments in hospitals and hospices are using it more. I'm not sure it's something that a lot of us regular folks are using in spiritual direction or when we accompany someone who's grieving. And yet you don't have to be a scholar to do it. In fact, I think Mary Oliver, a prize-winning American poet who just died a few years ago, really nailed it when she said, how people come from delight or the scars of damage to the comfort of a poem. Think about it. When do people want to read a poem? It's usually a significant event, a wedding, a baptism, a funeral. There's something in the human brain, I dare to say, that is kind of wired toward wanting the right words to commemorate a significant event. And not every poem is right, of course. And there is some poetry out there written about death that actually isn't all that helpful. It's more in the vein of, God needed another angel, which, as I've already shared, I think can do. If that comforts you, I'm happy for you. And I mean that truly. All right. But I've met so many people who become very allergic to that, to God, to that notion of God as somebody who willy-nilly, takes people from you. That does not comfort me, and I don't use it myself. So I would avoid poetry of that kind. I think what I tried to do, and I had two wonderful women, Virginia Douglas and Molly Bolton. Virginia is a retired social worker who's certified in the sacred art of living and dying, or she holds a certificate. And Molly Bolton is, until very recently, a chaplain in the Cleveland Clinic. She just moved. But those two women met with me for over a year. They're both poetry lovers. Molly is using poetry in her chaplaincy in fantastic ways, which I am going to share with you next Wednesday and tell stories about. So I hope you'll come back for that, because it's really, her experiences are very interesting. And we read about 1,000 poems before we picked the 70 that are in this book. Now, that doesn't make us anything special. It just makes us sensitive, as you are, to the needs of grievers and able to look at a poem and say, this does not exactly have the right stuff. This tells too much. This doesn't raise questions. It doesn't offer comfort in the way we think it should. And it doesn't acknowledge that grief can be excruciating and take a while. So that's why I put in this quote, which I love and which I often share when I do spiritual direction. Feeling lost, crazy, and desperate belongs to a good life as much as optimism, certainty, and reason. This is what I think we have a tendency to overlook. I'm all for positive psychology. I think it's a marvelous innovation in psychological research in the last 40 years. And I teach classes myself on the science of happiness and the science of optimism that teach us how to make active in our lives the findings of positive psychology. And I also think that people can take positivity to an almost toxic level, so that anything that smacks of grief or desperation or vulnerability is shunted to the side. How quickly can we get through that so we can get back to the good stuff, feeling happy? And that's not really how life is. That's not even how the life of Jesus unfolded. It's not the way the life of the saints unfolded. They all had times, I'm sure, when they felt lost, crazy, and desperate. And they often left us records of that in their own lives. It's one of the reasons we admire them, because they lived through those days and got to other days and instructed us by their witness. So I want to offer a model for understanding grief that's so easily reproducible that if you have a pen and paper near you, you can sketch this out for yourself and then be prepared to share it with others, going forward. And this was shared on Twitter by a woman named Lauren Herschel, who was grieving and who went to a doctor's appointment and shared with her physician that she really felt sometimes like she was losing it since she had suffered this loss. And the doctor took out a sketch pad and a pen and sketched this for her. And it helped her so much that she shared it on Twitter, and it quickly went viral onto Facebook and all kinds of other platforms because it really resonates with people. And that's why I want to share it with you. All right. It's not copyrighted or anything. She's put it out there for the good of the world, and I believe it to be in the public domain. So I'm sharing it, and you can too. So the model is called the ball and the box. And the physician sketched a box, and inside the box is a pain button on the left, and then the ball is the grief, the loss, the whatever the tragedy is. And he pointed out that in the beginning, the ball is huge, and you can't move the box around without the ball hitting the pain button. So every hour of every day at the beginning, the griever is hitting the pain button over and over again. Bing, bing, bing. It rattles around on its own in there. You can't control it. It just keeps hurting. And sometimes it seems unrelenting. And if you are at that stage in a loss now, I want to offer you the hope that the ball won't always be as big as it is now. On the other hand, there is nothing wrong with the ball being as big as it is now. That is normal. It's part of the tasks of mourning to feel it very deeply, even cruelly at the beginning. But over time, unless the person is stuck in their grief, and that's something we'll talk about next time, the ball does get smaller. It hits the button less and less often, but when it does, it hurts just as much. That's part of why I think the concept of a grief quake is useful, because people can go for weeks or months and be functioning pretty well, and then something hits that pain button head on, and it's a big grief quake. And sometimes people want to fight that, like, what's wrong with me? I thought I was doing better. Listen to the judgment in that of ourselves. How wonderful it would be if someone coached us to say, that just is what it is. This is part of grief. Grief quakes are normal, and that we would accept them and treat ourselves with compassion instead of fighting them. It's better. You feel better often because you can function day to day more easily. But the downside is that the ball randomly hits the button when you least expect it. For most people, the ball never really goes away. That doesn't mean they're not resilient. That doesn't mean they'll never be happy again. There are some people who think it's disloyal to be happy again after a loss. I knew one woman whose grandmother had suffered a loss when she was just a young woman. Her husband went to work one day and he never came home. And they didn't know if he abandoned the family or, fell into the river or was killed. They never found out what happened to him. And the sad thing, there's so many sad things about that. She went on to raise her kids by herself. She never remarried. But her way of coping or not coping with that horrible loss, a kind of loss we call an ambiguous loss, which is especially challenging, and which I'll talk about more on Wednesday, was to say often, I'll never get over it. I'll never get over it. And it was such a self-fulfilling prophecy that by the time my friend told me the story about her grandma was in her 90s, and the story of the loss of her husband was still one of the first stories she would tell about herself when she met somebody new. So how when you meet somebody new and you start talking about like who you are and what you've done and so on, that was the story that she made paramount in her life. And my friend said she always ends it the same way. And I never got over it. And she never did. Well, just think of all the pain embodied in that. The idea that grief is something you get over instead of learning to carry. The idea clearly implicit that she was somehow disloyal if she would have ever, married again. I mean, we could talk about that for an hour, but I invite you to think about that if you ever fall into that kind of self-talk. A gentler self-talk serves us better. We might even quantify it by saying, today I feel like I'll never be the same. And maybe I won't ever be the same, but I will be happy again. A time can come. So to conclude, Lauren Herschel's physician said to her that it hits less and less. You have more time to recover between hits, and that is a grace, unlike when the ball was still giant, and that she thought this was the best description she'd heard in a long time.